and his box will be the biggest box, so you can see him. So thanks so much, Patrick, for being here with us.
Well, thank you so much for joining, everybody. I hope everybody's doing okay over there in the U.S. and things are kind of like getting back to normal here in Israel somewhat. We did not get hit as hard with, illness and death and so things have been easing up in terms of restrictions here in Israel. We're always kind of like waiting for things to come back and we're nervous about it, but at the same time, we've been kind of like easing up and like my kids have been back at school for a few weeks. Restaurants have been open, malls have been open. People are wearing masks and being cautious, but thank goodness Israel's been like kind of weathering the storm, I think, pretty well. But we really miss, like, tourism is such a big part of Israel, and we really just miss all the visitors. Personally, like, this has been a very hard time for me, just not being able to guide and, organize trips and see people here and all the families and the bar mitzvahs and the bat mitzvahs and the JWRP trips and birthright. It's really hitting us all very, very hard. So this is a nice thing to do, just to kind of like reconnect with people and stay connected, because we are kind of like isolated, and Israel's like always been this thing that connects us together and brings us together. And so without that, we have to find new ways to do it. So I'm really happy to be here with you. Nicole asked me to do this webinar like a month ago, and I would like to kind of do, in the next like half hour, 40 minutes, whatever it is. I kind of put together a little bit of a presentation about, a tour that I like to take with people. Israel's a small country, but it's not boring, okay? It's forests and deserts and mountains and valleys and Red Seas and Dead Seas. And there's really something for everybody here. I like the picture of Petra behind you there, ma'am. Jordan is definitely hurting in terms of tourism. I mean, I was in Petra a couple of years ago. I remember getting on the bus on the tour, and they're like, welcome to Petra. Tourism to Petra accounts for 25% of Jordan's economy. And I was like, wow, 25% of their economy depends on one tourist site? I was like, I'm safe. Definitely we're safe visiting, because like they're not going to mess with that kind of income, right? In Israel, tourism is, I think, like 2%, 3% of our income, so we can like weather the storm. But, imagine Petra right now, nobody's there. The pyramids, nobody's there. The hotels in Israel all empty, and we're really waiting for the day that it comes back. So, you can come to Israel for like 7 or 10 days and you'll never see it all and do it all. There's just always like new things to see and do and enjoy. So I put together a bit of a tour here, which is like maybe a little bit off the beaten path. It is a tour of Megiddo, the Jezreel Valley, and Beit She'an. All right. I'm going to try to like kick into share my screen here so you guys can see me. Give me just a second, please. You guys hear me okay? Yeah, everybody hears me all right? All right. Can you see that? You see the itinerary on the screen? Okay. Just one more sec.
Can you do it as a slideshow?
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that right now. Let me get into this. I had a little bit of a computer problem, so I'm using my wife's computer. Let me just give me 1 second. This is like every like Saturday Night Live sketch, right? Like technical difficulties on a Zoom call. All right. Let's just go with it. You guys can see it. Basically, when you come to Israel, I usually do a lot of like family trips, family tours with like grandparents, parents, and kids. And, you want everybody to have a good time, explore and see as much as you can, but really keep it interesting for everybody, and like, impressing an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old is not always so easy. But Israel can do that, because I find that like a lot of the history and even the archaeology is really interesting to kids. It's not something that like you see normally where you live. You come to Israel, things are so ancient, and, you know, especially like with the Jewish connection as well. And then on top of it, the modern connection. You're not just going to like some old dusty site. You're going to some old dusty site, and then like 5 minutes away is something super modern and people are living there. So there's really something for everybody. But generally, when you're coming to Israel, you know, you're usually going to like have a base. You know, Jerusalem is a great base because it's right in the middle of the country. Tel Aviv is a great base. It's kind of also in the middle of the country. I always like to describe Israel as a country kind of like California. Okay, it's like a long, skinny country. Jerusalem is right in the middle of that. And Israel's kind of like 3 long strips. Along the coast, where like 75% of Jewish Israelis live, it's very flat. And it's most industry, most of the cities are along the coast. So you could kind of think of like Tel Aviv, like LA, and Haifa, like San Francisco. Except there it would take you about 5 hours to drive. Here it would take you about an hour and a half to drive. So it's very flat, it's very fertile. Most of Israelis live along the coast, kind of like LA to San Francisco or Miami to Orlando. So Israel is really like a tiny little country where people are densely populated and concentrated in one area. Then in the middle of the country, you have the mountains. And Jerusalem's right in the middle of those mountains. And just below Jerusalem, they're called the Judean Hills. Just above Jerusalem, they're called the Sumerian Mountains. And just above that is the mountains of Galilee, all right? In between the Galilee Mountains and the Samaritan Mountains is the Jezreel Valley. This is one of the areas that we're gonna kind of like visit on this tour, all right? The third strip of the country, going a little bit further east now, is the Dead Sea or the Jordan Valley. And that Jordan Valley is a very important valley that's like a highway of humanity from Africa into Asia. All right. Same with the coast. The coast is like a natural highway that connects Egypt to Syria. You know, let's say Africa to Mesopotamia. So Israel is kind of like in the middle of everywhere. If you zoom out and Google map the land of Israel, you'll see that we're kind of sandwiched right between Africa in the south, Asia to the east, and Europe to the west. So we're in the middle of everywhere. And I always ask, like, is that a good place to be or a bad place to be? What's the answer? The answer is, of course, it depends on what you want to do there. All right. If you want to like do business and trade, well, you know how it says made in China on your shirt? It's been like that for thousands of years. So Israel's like right in the middle of that, you know, moving merchandise from the east to the west and the north to the south, all the spices and textiles. But if you want to live a nice, quiet life, then this might not be the place for you, because this is a land of conflict. All right. I call this the land of 3 C's. It's the land of crossroads, a land of conflict, and a land of connections, all right? And so this all kind of plays out, the geography and the politics and the history and the biblical references, everything is connected, all right? So basically, I would say that a good day trip is what we're about to do, all right? Israel's a small country from like Jerusalem or Tel Aviv in the middle up to the northern border of Lebanon or the Galilee. You're talking about 2.5, 3 hour drive. So you could do things like that in one day, go back to where you started. But generally, there's so much to explore and see up in the northern part of Israel that you really want to spend at least one night, maybe 2, especially when you're coming with the kids, especially in the summertime when there's great hikes and water activities to do. But basically, let's say we're leaving from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. We would be driving north along the coast of Israel. And the coast of Israel is today where like 75% of Jewish Israelis live, like in Tel Aviv, Rishon LeZion, Kfar Saba, Herzliya, Netanya, all the way up to Haifa, like the Israeli cities where your friends and cousins live. But thousands of years ago in like biblical times, it was also like a very important connecting road from Egypt up to Syria and Mesopotamia. All right. Once we kind of drive north along the coast, you'll be hitting a mountain called Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is a beautiful mountain. There's famous Carmel Mount, you know, the city or the town of Carmel in California, which is named after Mount Carmel in the land of Israel, because Carmel, or like the Shuk HaCarmel, which Nicole, we went to in Tel Aviv, you know, the word Carmel speaks about bounty. It's Kerem El, the vineyard of God. Just plant the grapes and you'll have beautiful wines. And that's why Israel's most famous winery is the Carmel Winery. And then from there, we kind of cut through the Jezreel Valley. I want to take you to a place called Beit She'an. look at some of the beautiful images here. That's Mount Carmel there on the left, kind of like popping up from the coast of Israel. From the coast is just kind of like really flat, and then all of a sudden this mountain just erupts out of the flat landscape, and that's kind of unusual. It stands alone. It's surrounded by valley and very, very fertile, and so all the kind of rain and soil goes down into those valleys, providing this excellent fertile soil. So you know that when we're talking about the agriculture of the land of Israel, whether it's wine or fish or wheat, it's all growing in this area up north. You could see on the right-hand corner there a very famous moshav named Nahalal, which is in the Jezreel Valley. It's very photographed from above, and it kind of looks like a bicycle wheel, and everybody kind of, you know how Jews like to dance the hora, we're always kind of like pointing towards the center. So Nahalal is a very famous moshav that was built there back in the 1920s. Moshe Dayan, who I'll speak about a little bit later, our famous, eye-patched commander-in-chief, he's buried in Moshav Nahalal. Just to see kind of where we are here, a little map. You can see the land of Israel there on the right, a long skinny country with Eilat down there, the southern tip, and up at the northern section, the Golan Heights and the Lebanese border. And then you can see kind of like the area in the middle that kind of looks like a kidney bean would be, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, with Jerusalem right in the middle of that. And then the left part, is the coast where most Israelis live today. And then that red blotch right there is the Jezreel Valley, okay? Emek Israel. If Carmel is the vineyard of God, Israel or Jezreel is the seed of God. Let's be honest. The land of Israel, is it a good land or is it not a good land? And again, the answer is it depends. Okay, first of all, we're in a part of the world, the Middle East, where most of our neighboring countries are extreme deserts. And then all of a sudden, you kind of go to northern Israel and you see this, very fertile area. 80% or something that Israel grows in terms of agriculture is exported. We truly are a land of milk and honey. But at the same time, it's a very difficult land. You don't just like plant the seed and watch it grow. You've got to plow the land. You've got to get rid of the rocks. You have to build terraces. You have to figure out the right crops in the right time. Heck, even the most secular kibbutznik will say, Baruch Hashem, my crops grew this year. You know what I mean? Like, it's a tough land. It demands a kind of relationship. So when you have a valley that provides its own nourishments, you call it the valley, the valley of Jezreel, Israel. El is God's name, and Zerah is seed. So like the seed of God. Plant the seed, God will make it grow. And that's kind of the area that we're talking about, the Jezreel Valley, sandwiched in between Mount Carmel, the Galilee Mountains, and the Sumerian Mountains to the south. The first stop I kind of want to take you on, I'm going to show you some like drone video of an amazing site called Tel Megiddo. Has anybody been to Megiddo? I can't see everybody, but if you've been to Megiddo, okay, man, with the Petra backdrop, I kind of assumed you would have gone to Megiddo, okay? Because, it's not a site that people often go to, right? It's especially, Nicole, have you ever even heard of Megiddo? No, fair question, okay? It's honestly a fair question because it's one of these sites in Israel which most people have not been to. Unfortunately, it's one of the most important and historically significant and amazing sites in Israel. So how come we haven't been there? How come we don't really go there? So there's a few answers to that question. Let me just kind of play some video here for you guys, and maybe I'll give a little commentary as we go. Let me pop it into full screen here. Look at that. A Tel, T-E-L, all right, is a mountain with civilizations built on top. You're seeing kind of an aerial view here now of Tel Megiddo, T-E-L, all right? Thousands of years ago, this was the land of Canaan, and the Canaanites lived in certain areas. What kind of areas did Canaanites live in, or any human beings for that matter? They always chose a bit of a mountaintop. because that would give them protection and defense and also views of the area. They always needed to live near a water source, and they always needed to live near fertile area where they could grow food. They also wanted to live on a crossroads so they can trade, all right? And they wanted to have like natural defenses. So thousands of years ago, this was the land of Canaan. The Canaanites were the first to build Megiddo. But then the Israelites came and conquered the Canaanites and built on top of them. But then guess what? The Babylonians came and destroyed the Israelites and built on top of them. And then the Jews came back and built. And then the Greeks and the Christians and the Romans and the Muslims and the Crusaders and the British and the Israelis. Are you with me? Like everybody's kind of living on top of each other. And that's called a tell. There are tells that have 2 or 3 or 4 layers of civilizations. Tell Megiddo has 24 layers of civilization. Okay, it is the most extensive tell in the Middle East. It has to be a place of conflict, because if you're just living on the same mountaintop for thousands of years, then great, good for you. But this idea of like destruction and return, destruction and return. And look at this beautiful sights there. You could see some of the palm trees, the date palms. That's unusual. We're in northern Israel. There's no date palms here. In the early 1900s, a team of explorers from Germany came here. And they were the first. It was Schumacher and his team from Germany were the first ones to kind of come and explore Megiddo and identify Megiddo. In those days, the techniques of archaeology weren't as advanced. If you've ever been to an archaeological site today, and I really recommend, especially when you come with kids, there's like archaeological dig for a day and sifting projects. You're going through things with like buckets and sometimes toothbrushes. Okay, Schumacher is going to take like almost like a bulldozer and just create a scar, like a trench through Megiddo, and unfortunately destroys a lot of the artifacts there. In the 1920s, the British and the Americans started digging up Megiddo. If you ever go to Chicago, I know Phoenix and Chicago have a bit of a connection. If you're ever in Chicago, go visit at the University of Chicago, the Oriental Institute, okay? Because University of Chicago was one of the great exploring universities back in the early 1900s, and they discovered incredible treasures, not only in Israel, but also in Iraq and Iran and Egypt, and they took it back to Chicago. When my sister lives in Chicago, I went to visit the Oriental Institute a few years ago. I was like the only person there, okay? But I'm a geeky tour guide who loves this kind of thing. So I really recommend, you'll see some of the artifacts from Megiddo. And in those, excavations in the 1920s and 30s, they were using volunteers who were eating dates, and they just chucked their pits on the ground. And that's the story of why there's date palms, okay? Megiddo is really going to be mentioned in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the book of Kings, as a site that's going to be built by King Solomon. Now that's huge, okay? Because King David, King Solomon, okay, the Torah goes on to list, let me just play it for you another time here, but the Torah goes on to list many, many kings of Israel and Judea, but King David and King Solomon, these are names that all around the world reverberate with people. And so King Solomon is going to build the first temple in Jerusalem. And he's also going to fortify 3 cities, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And in each one of these cities, he's going to build a fortification, a wall, and an entrance gate into the city. And each gate looks the same. It's called a 3-chambered gate. On each side of the gate are like 3 chambers that you would enter through the city. And that's what they found here in Megiddo. They also found an incredible water system, because if you're kind of like the king of the hill and you're on top of the hill, but your water source is down below, what happens if you come under siege? You're going to choke. You're going to dehydrate. You're going to die because your water's outside your city. So in all of these ancient tells, including Jerusalem, by the way, if you've been to the city of David in Jerusalem, you always have to have like an internal water source, usually underground. Usually you get there through like a tunnel system, and that's exactly what Megiddo has. You can see part of the water system right there. So a very extensive tell, 25 layers of civilization. You might have a book in your bookshelf or in your parents' home called The Source by James Michener. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, pick it up. It's a great book, like to read by the beach or by the pool, about the history of this land through the different layers of the tell. Megiddo is right at the crossroads between this coastal road, which today we travel on in Israel whenever we want to go from Jerusalem to Tzfat. We go towards the coast and then travel north. In Roman times, they called it the Via Maris, which is the road or the way of the sea, because you're like literally traveling right along the coast. And so right where Megiddo is a junction between the Via Maris and the Jezreel Valley. And the Jezreel Valley will then take you east towards Damascus. And you're like, well, why do I want to go to Damascus? Well, up until about 50 years ago, Damascus was one of the great cities of the world. Think like London or Chicago, okay? A great city with, you know, markets and industry, and even Abraham went to Damascus. So you have to understand that this hilltop is a major junction in the land of Israel, but even globally. That's not an understatement, okay? One of the first, you know, cities in history. Let's just exit out of here. Just mentioning some of the biblical verses, because Megiddo is mentioned in the Torah. I'd mentioned that, I'll just read it out, but this was the purpose of the forced labor which Solomon imposed. King Solomon, it was to build the house of the Lord, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, his own palace, which he builds near the temple, the Milo, or the Milo, which is like a fortified area kind of between his palace and the temple, and the wall of Jerusalem. And he fortified Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. So Jerusalem, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer are the four cities that are mentioned as Solomon's cities, fortified. These are not necessarily cities that he builds, but that he rebuilds. And because the Canaanites had already built them, but he fortifies them. And you can see that image there of what's a capital, okay, the top of a column. And this is really what's known as like a royal capital. And only in royal structures and palaces that were built by the kings of Judea do they find this decoration. I always, you know, sometimes like tour guides say things that we like hardly believe ourselves, you know, and I can remember saying this to somebody and he's like, oh, you know what? I just came back from China. And in China, they have the same thing. They have decorations that can only be used in, you know, the royal palaces, or, you know, in the important structures. So there's such an idea that even design and interior design and architecture is reserved for certain classes, and especially for royalty. Another story that's mentioned in the Torah about Megiddo is about the king Josiah, okay? Yoshia, who was considered to be a tzaddik, a very righteous king. But in his days, the Pharaoh Necho, okay, who was the king of Egypt, marched against the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah marched toward him, but when he confronted him at Megiddo, Pharaoh Necho slew him. Basically, Josiah was saying, like, no, you can't pass through here. And Pharaoh Necho, being the superpower of the time, said, hey, get out of the way, king. I'm marching through here. And so the Egyptians are going to take over Megiddo. Now, I asked earlier, who's been to Megiddo? And the truth is, I can only see a few of you over here. I can't see everybody. But I assume that out of like 10, 11, 12 people that are on this call, maybe 2 or 3 have been to Megiddo, okay? I would not be surprised if, I would be surprised actually if you've been to Megiddo. And the question is why? There's a couple of answers. Number one is because Israel has many sites. And when you're coming, you're usually limited. There's always like trip A, trip B, trip C. You know, trip A, you've got to go to Tel Aviv, the Western Wall, Masada. And trip B, you can kind of like, you know, venture off a little bit more, maybe visit Hebron, or depends on what interests you. Trip C is like, okay, a little more off the beaten path. But honestly, Israel truly is a land of layers, okay? You can come here many, many times. And I know people who travel here every year and always like, show me something new, show me something different. But a big reason why most Jewish people haven't been to Megiddo is because it actually has been like kind of adopted a little bit more as a Christian site. You know, the word Armageddon, all right? The battle at the end of days. Well, that word Armageddon comes from Har Megiddo. Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo, becomes Armageddon when it gets translated to Greek. And this concept of like the battle at the end of days, right? The end of days. And well, again, being in the middle of everywhere. Now, this battle between East and West, where can it play out? One of the battlefields would be the land of Israel. And especially with evangelical Christians, and maybe there's Christians on this call, I'm not sure. And if there are, you're welcome, and everybody's welcome. You might be more familiar with this site than Jews who go to the JCC, who may have never even heard about it, because it's spoken about in the Christian Bible. And there is not a Christian, especially evangelical Christian group that comes to Israel that does not visit Megiddo. Whereas Jewish groups tend to kind of like, I would say maybe stay away unless they're specializing in biblical history or biblical tells. All right. I just mentioned wine as, you know, one of the bounties of the land of Israel. Today we have over 200 wineries, and Megiddo sits right near Mount Carmel. And Carmel, again, is Kerem El, the vineyard of God. And so that says something, you know, that there's this excellent terroir for growing grapes and wine production. Today we have over 200 wineries in Israel, and I really recommend and suggest and you know, really implore even for you to buy the Israeli wine, all right, and support the Israeli wine industry and buy the Israeli snacks. And, you know, especially now that we can't visit, it's kind of, it's another way to help Israel and also do something great and enjoy amazing products. Especially when you come to Israel, though, it's definitely a stop on the way, especially when you have a tour guide that's doing the driving or a bus driver. You can enjoy a nice lunch. I have a picture here of the Tishbe winery, because Mount Carmel is also another famous biblical stories about Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu HaTishbe. Eliyahu the prophet, Eliyahu the grape harvester. So even back 3,000 years ago, Elijah made wine. And so he lived and prophesied from Mount Carmel. And so in modern times, in 1882, the first wineries were opened up, and one of them is the Tishbe winery in a beautiful town on Mount Carmel called Zichron Yaakov. Okay, really kind of a stop along the way. Definitely a trip B kind of thing to do. When you've been there, done that, you might want to spend a night or two in Zichron Yaakov as part of like modern Israel. Speaking about that, I just want to show a picture here of Yehoshua Henkin. Maybe you've never heard the name before, but you know, today in Israel, we have almost 9 million Israeli citizens. Okay, almost 9 million people live in Israel. How many of those are Jewish? Almost 7 million, just about like 6.8 million. So that means that, and the rest being Muslim and some Christian, but mostly Arab Muslims. So Israel's about 75% Jewish, with 6.5 to 7 million Jews living in the land of Israel today in the year 2020. How many Jews lived here in 1920, 100 years ago? All right, maybe 250,000. How did we go from 250,000 to almost 7 million in less than 100 years? It's not just because we have a lot of kids and a high birth rate. Okay, I have 5 kids, God bless. But like the main reason is because people moved to Israel and made aliyah from Russia, Romania, Hungary, Morocco, like where my family's from, America, you know, but mostly Europe and the surrounding Arab countries like Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Syria. But how did that all kind of play out? Like, where does the story of modern Israel begin? So just in a nutshell, it really begins in the year 1882. In 1882, the first kind of Zionists come here and start to rebuild the land and rebuild some cities. Had you come to this land in 1881, you basically would have had 4 choices of where to live as a Jew. Okay, and that's what we call the 4 holy cities: Jerusalem, Hebron, Tzfat, and Tiberias. Those were the 4 holy cities that always had a Jewish population, always had a connection to Jewish history, and even to like current present times. But in 1882, the Jews say, no, we want to start something new. We don't want to live in the old towns. And they start 4 new towns. And you've probably heard of these 4 new towns as well. One of them is Zichron Yaakov, which I just mentioned. Another one is Rishon LeZion, which means the first in Zion. Another is Petach Tikva, which today is like a modern city near the airport. And the 4th is Rosh Pina, a beautiful little kind of like hilltop near Tzfat in the Galilee. So in 1882, something like 25 to 30,000 Jews come over the next 20 years, and we start to rebuild modern towns in Israel. And now, the movement is starting to move, and you're starting to get Theodore Herzl and the modern Zionist movement, and petitioning the colonial powers like the British. So in 1904, you're going to have the World Zionist Congress, where the leaders of the Jewish world are going to convene together, and they're going to basically start 3 organizations. One is the Jewish Agency, the other is the Jewish National Fund, and the third is the Israel Appeal, or the Karen Kayemet, Karen Kayemet Israel is JNF, the Jewish National Fund. The other is the Israel Appeal, or the Federation System. Number 1, you have to raise money. Number 2, you have to buy land. And number 3, you have to convince Jews that it's a good idea to move here and help them move here. And that's when things start to really roll in like the early 1900s, where you're going to get the second Aliyah in 1903. And then World War I. And now World War I, the land goes from being part of the Ottoman Empire to now being controlled by the British. And when the British come here in 1917, they're going to write the famous Balfour Declaration, declaring that the British see with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. The first empire in 2,000 years to tell the Jews to come back. Every other empire says stay out. Or if you do come, you can live here, but not there. And that's kind of how we get these little Jewish quarters and these little towns. But with the British, now the floodgates really open. And so we need to build and purchase land and build cities to absorb all these new immigrants. Yehoshua Henkin is responsible for buying something like 20,000 acres of land in the Jezreel Valley. In those days, a lot of the lands were owned by wealthy Arab families, mostly living in places like Beirut and Damascus. And they would have like sharecroppers or peasant farmers working the land, but the land was owned by wealthy families. And so Yehoshua Henkin goes to Beirut, strikes a deal to purchase lands in the Jezreel Valley. He didn't have the money. Once he made the deal, then he went back to the Zionist movement and said, I got the deal, now get the money. And they did, and they got the money. Now, what kind of land could they purchase in those days? Not the best land. They purchased swampland. When you have a valley surrounded by mountains, it's true you're going to have water going down into that valley, irrigating it, but you're also going to have swamp. And so a lot of that land was actually swamp. So if you've ever heard that the Zionists drained the swamps, the Jezreel Valley is one of the areas that was drained. Later, Moshe Dayan, who you can see in the photo here, a real Sabra, an Israeli born, he's born on Kibbutz Degania, not far from the Jezreel Valley, but he is buried on Moshav Nahalal, that photo that I showed you earlier with the wheel. So next time you're in Israel, you want to visit kind of an area that's maybe a little bit different, definitely take a drive through this beautiful Jezreel Valley. Very close to the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, kind of close to everything, but not that close to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv that you just go for lunch and come back. You kind of want to make like a day out of it, or like I said, even 2 days or 3 days out of it. You're very near to Haifa here as well. And so there's great things to do. The Jezreel Valley is mostly agriculture and small kibbutzim and moshavim. The only real city that I can think of that you may have heard of in the Jezreel Valley is perhaps Afula, all right? But, all these little kibbutzim and moshavim that dot the Jezreel Valley, this is the breadbasket of Israel. So people live there. First of all, if you're close to Haifa, you're close to all the high tech. Just like a little anecdote, but cities in America are often partnered up with cities in Israel. So when you raise money through your local federation, part of that money goes to your partner region or your partner city in Israel. I'm not sure which one is connected to Phoenix. Do you guys know? You should research it. There's probably Phoenix is connected to a city in Israel somehow, and it's called like the partnership. So Michigan or Detroit is a community that I guide a lot of people from, and their partnership is the Jezreel Valley and parts of the Galilee. And so whenever I tour with people from Detroit or Michigan, they always want to go to the Jezreel Valley. And so I remember a couple of years ago, I was touring with a family, And we went to visit a kibbutz, and the young man on the kibbutz was showing us around. And if you've ever been on a tour like this, you know, it's like visiting family. Like, you have to do it. It's not always that much fun, but you kind of have to do it. And so we're like walking around the kibbutz, and he's like, do you guys want to see the metal workshop? And I'm like, you know, we don't really have time. We have to get the spot, you know. He's like, no, let me show you the metal workshop. I'm like, okay, I'm being polite. He like swings open this huge barn door, and what's being made inside this barn? The Iron Dome. You know the Iron Dome? The missiles that shoot out, the missiles that are fired from Gaza and Hamas. Parts of the Iron Dome are being made in like a metal workshop on a kibbutz in the Jezreel Valley. You know, like, welcome to Israel. 30 years ago, you came to pick apples on a kibbutz. Today, you come to work for Apple. It's a different Israel. You know, it's a different Israel. So just like a little anecdote. I just want to, let's see some like beautiful images again. I love these videos. If you just kind of go to YouTube and just like put in, you know, Israel from a drone or Israel from above, you could see some of the beautiful agriculture. Just enjoy some of the scenes here for a minute of the land flowing with milk and honey. You know, if you bite into a piece of fruit or a piece of food in the land of Israel, chances are it grew in the Jezreel Valley. That's Mount Tabor or Mount Tabor. That's a very important mountain, as well as a kind of geographical division between the tribes of Israel. Devorah, the prophetess, prophesied from the top of Mount Tabor or Mount Tabor. You could see the hills of Lower Galilee right there. So a lot of water, a lot of fertile soil, and also like a natural transport route, okay? When you have mountains blocking access, a valley will always be the kind of like the natural highway. So we're talking about like a highway of humanity. It's part of the reason why Armageddon and kind of this crossroads and conflict. All right, just something beautiful to see and reminisce. You know, as much as I love doing these virtual tours, I can't wait to do the real thing again. I mean, you know, the last few months I've been doing some virtual tours with synagogues and people and groups and everything, but there's nothing like the real thing. So I'm really like, I just want to take a minute and like invite you all back to Israel, you know, when the skies open up and when things, you know, open up again. I just really can't wait. And I can't wait to like go back to the Western Wall and the Kotel and all these sites with people. I think it's going to be very, very special and very meaningful when people start to come back for all of us. Okay, shawarma. It's lunchtime. All right. The truth is, there's such great food in this part of the country. Whenever you go to like a part of Israel that's like a bread basket, the food is always going to be phenomenal. All right, compared to like maybe the desert or even some of the cities, where the food is also great. But you know, here you're talking about like fruits and vegetables being picked literally in the backyard. So you know, lunchtime is always important to have good food, especially when you're touring with families and kids. Options for everybody. People are picky eaters. You always have to go somewhere where there's a few different options, but just, you know, to just like bite into that shawarma. Does not look delicious. I just put that in there. And driving through the Jezreel Valley, you would be getting to an amazing site called Beit She'an, one of my favorite sites in Israel. Most people are like, Bet the what? Beit She'an. Beit means house. She'an doesn't really have a meaning, but some people say it's like Beit Sha'ar, which is like the house of the gates. In the Talmud, our rabbis tell us that Beit She'an is the entrance to the Garden of Eden, to Gan Eden. And you have to understand, like, you have to look at the geography of the Middle East, surrounded by deserts, and then all of a sudden, kind of like right in the middle, through the land of Israel, maybe parts of Syria and even Iraq, you have this kind of like lush, like Garden of Eden. And so this entranceway would be this most amazing site of Beit She'an. Let me just show you this video. I'll talk about it a little bit. The thing with Beit She'an is it's a little bit harder to get to because it's not where the coastal plain meets the Jezreel Valley like Megiddo. It's where the Jordan Valley meets the Jezreel Valley. And so to drive to Beit She'an, normally you're going from Jerusalem to the north through the Jordan Valley, which is one of the most spectacular drives in this land. I really recommend, especially if you've been here and done that. renting a car, maybe hiring a guide for a day, or even exploring on your own. Beit She'an, okay, is again an ancient Canaanite tell. You can see the mountain right there, which the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Israelites built on top of. But then down below, about 2,000 years ago, as part of the Roman Empire, the Romans come to Beit She'an and rebuild Beit She'an down below into an amazing Roman city. It's kind of like the Pompeii of Israel. You know, you're driving through this valley, the tour guide's like, hey, let me take you to Beit She'an. You're like, okay. And then you walk into this national park and you just can't believe, you know, the remnants that are left behind, the roads and the bathhouses. Let me just go back again here and just play it again. Back in the 1950s and 60s, again, as more and more Jews were pouring into this land, all right, between the different aliyahs of the first aliyah, the second aliyah, the British, and then post-World War I. And by 1948, you're going to have 600,000 Jews in this land. By 1951, you're going to have 1.2 million. By 1965, you're going to have 3.5 million. And by 1999, you're going to have like 6 million. So the population is like rapidly increasing. And let's be honest about it too. I grew up in Montreal, Canada. I made Aliyah 15 years ago to live in Jerusalem. I live a pretty comfortable life here. But my family from Morocco, my dad is one of 12 kids. He was the only one that went to Montreal. All 11 of my aunts and uncles and my grandparents came to Israel in 1963 and settled here. And what a different life, you know? Very difficult times in the 50s and 60s. Israel almost had to cut off immigration at a certain point with rationing. And, you know, sometimes you drive around Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Tiberias, and you look at the buildings and you're like, this looks like the projects. Guess what? It is the projects, okay? Israel is a country of immigrants and refugees. It's a country where people came here because they wanted to. Hello. And it's a country where people came here because they had to. They had nowhere else to go. And when you think about that, well, who's going to provide for these people? Well, the state of Israel and the Jewish communities around the world. And so we really are today, 70 years later, doing much better, you know, than we were 70 years ago because of these hard beginnings. So imagine coming to this land in 1955 or 53 and be like, okay, I want to go to Tel Aviv or I want to go to Haifa. And the Jewish agency being like, sorry guys, no vacancy. You're going to Beit She'an. And they're like, bet the what? So in the 1950s and 60s, you know, Israel kind of builds this modern city of Beit She'an. And as they kind of like dig into the ground to build the foundation for the new city, they find ancient Beit She'an. And that's why when you go to visit the archaeological garden of Beit She'an, you're not going out like an hour into the fields. You're going to downtown Beit She'an. That's why you can see the city, which is kind of amazing. The Romans are going to build here a most impressive city. They're going to call it Scythopolis. And it's not really mentioned so much in the Torah because it's a later city. It's mentioned more in the Mishnah and the Talmud and also in the New Testament in the Christian Bible, okay, as a city of one of the important gateway cities leading to Damascus and kind of like the expansion. So again, Christians go to Beit She'an, but a lot of Jews go to Beit She'an as well. I go here as much as I can with people, especially when they're interested in history and archaeology. You can see the beautiful theater there, one of the most impressive theaters in the land of Israel. And so I really do invite you, seriously, that when you come back to Israel to visit Beit She'an, in the summer, it's one of the hottest places in the country, all right? So they have like a nighttime show, but really the best time to visit Israel in general is like spring, you know, like March, maybe like between Purim and Passover, or late fall, kind of like Thanksgiving or early December. Those are the best times. The weather's great. The crowds are a little bit limited. You know, before this like COVID thing hit, we were at the peak of tourism like never before. We had more tourists in 2019 than we've ever had before. And then this all kind of came crashing down. So it's going to take a while to rebuild. So again, I'm just kind of like re-inviting you all back here, especially with your kids, all right? Especially to celebrate a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. You can see some of the images here of Beit She'an. Those are some girls over there from, again, talking about the partnership. Beit Shean is partnered with Cleveland. So whenever I'm with, families from Cleveland, we always stop there. You could see they're sitting on this massive Capitol. By the way, if you're into like Monty Python, there's a famous movie, The Life of Brian, which was filmed in Beit Shean. The only real mention of Beit Shean in the Torah, it's actually an interesting one. I was mentioning before the kings, King Solomon and King David. But King David was the second king of Israel. King Solomon was the third king of Israel. Who was the first king of Israel? The first king of Israel was King Saul, Shaul. All right, King Saul. And if you read about King Saul, you'll learn he's a bit like an accidental monarch. He's got some personality. He doesn't really do the job that he's ordered to do. And his death is very tragic. He leads the army of Israel into battle against the Philistines. The Philistines capture him, they torture him, and they're about to kill him when he turns to his servant boy and says, "Take out my sword and put it through me. I'm not going to allow the Philistines to kill me. I'm going to die. I'm going to fall on my own sword rather than be killed by these Philistines." And the boy says, "I can't do it, sire." So what does King Saul do? He takes his own life. It's kind of an interesting, story. We often talk about it in Masada in terms of suicide and things like that. And the Philistines take his body. This is the king of Israel, okay? They take his body, they chop off his head, and they hang his head on a spear on the walls of Beit Shean. I remember telling my kids this story a few weeks ago, and they're like, "Is his head still there?" I'm like, "No, his head's not there anymore." But, kind of an amazing story and connection, and really shows us the age of this place. This is all in one day, okay? We did Megiddo, we did a winery, we had shawarma, we went through the Jezreel Valley, we drove, we talked, we told stories, we went to Beit Shean, and a great way to kind of finish off the day is to jump in a spring, to jump in a beautiful, especially in the summertime. But the truth is, there is a place here called Gan Hashlosha, or Sachne, talking about the Garden of Eden. This is just a few minutes away from Beit Shean. It's in an area known as the Valley of the Springs. The water temperature here always stays at about 22, 23 degrees Celsius, which is not super hot, but it's not super cold either. So in the cold winter, the water feels warm. And in the hot summer, the water feels refreshing and cool. It's one of the most popular places for Israelis, especially Israelis, to go and cool off and swim and picnic. And so just to kind of end off the day, especially with your kids, and Israel's not boring. It's many things, but it's not boring. And, making those memories is what a trip to Israel is all about. And so, with that, I just kind of want to wish you all, luck and prosperity and health and happiness. And I hope a return to Israel soon, really soon, okay, in the right time. But I hope, I'm a little bit down, I'll be honest, because the longer this goes on, the longer it feels like it's going to go on. But I really think that, we're going to make the necessary changes and people will get a little bit wiser. We're really thinking about you guys in America. Usually it's America saying to Israel, we're really thinking about you in Israel, but we're really thinking and praying for everybody, okay, here and there and everywhere, and that things should get better really soon with the health and the politics and the business and and all the layoffs and everything. And so I really just want to in my humble way, send some blessings from Jerusalem, and that we think about you and we're all connected together. And thank you so much for allowing me to just talk about what I love to talk about. And that's it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was awesome. And now I have places I need to come back and see. Lots of places. But really, thank you so much.
I hope you could hear me well.
Yeah, it was great.
I hope you could hear and see everything well.
It was great.
And let's do it. Let's do it for real next time.
Yes. Thank you so much for taking the time to do that. Now you have to go to sleep, and you have 5 kids in the morning. And thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. And I really can't thank you enough. It was awesome.
Oh, fantastic. All right.
Thanks,
Nice to meet
Patrick.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Nicole.
Bye.
Thank you, Patrick.